This is Duke University.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Duke MBA Finance Club Symposium. We have a special treat for everybody, but first I would like to give a special thanks to those who helped us put on this event. We have the Law School and the MMS program. Then we have Vanessa Granados and especially Sejal Udandi. Sejal was instrumental in putting this event together, so please give a round of applause to her. The first thing I would like to do is present the annual Distinguished Alumni Award. This individual has been the brains and the passion behind the CFE and has been unwavering in his commitment to the improvement of MBA finance education at Fuqua. This has translated into the development of unprecedented programming and events at Fuqua that have undoubtedly benefited Fuqua's finance students. He actually just put on an event, the Women's in Finance event. I don't know if anybody attended that event, but it was a great event just last night. And the winner of this award is Seth Gardner, Executive Director of the CFE. Thank you. We actually have all the awards coming in.
Unexpected, but the time that I've been spending here is my honor and my privilege, and it's all for you guys.
Thank you. So now, I'm going to introduce Kyle Kavanaugh. Kyle Kavanaugh is the Vice President of the Administration at Duke University. He has held the position of Senior Vice President for Administration at the University of Florida. Before assuming the role at Florida, he held senior positions at the University of Texas at Austin, Rice University, and Vanderbilt University at the Medical Center. Kyle is an active member of the National Association of College and Business Officers, and he holds an MBA from Belmont University along with a master's degrees from Vanderbilt and the University of Illinois, Chicago. His undergrad degree is from Tusculum College. Kyle Kavanaugh. Appreciate it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. There we go. Roger told me that if I did convince him to come here, that this had to be interactive. So I kind of warmed you up a little bit for him. When I was in your seat many, many years ago, I had the opportunity to listen to a number of different guest speakers that would come in as part of the MBA program. And I probably wasn't as aware of the unique opportunity those presentations presented. And so I strongly encourage you this afternoon to not only listen attentively, but if you've got really hard questions about kind of where the economy is and where the economy is going, and about the finance world and the world of retirement and retirement planning, I'd break them out this afternoon and make sure you hit Roger with each of those. By way of introduction, Roger Ferguson is someone I've known now for several years. He's the president and CEO of TIAA-CREF, and that organization, if you're not familiar with it, is a leading provider of retirement services in the academic, research, medical, and cultural fields, and a Fortune 100 financial service organization with more than $460 billion under active management. Roger served as vice chairman of the Board of Governors for the U.S. Federal Reserve System. Prior to joining TIAA-CREF, he had a rather distinguished experiences in the consulting world, finance world, and the law world. He did receive his academic training all at Harvard, BA, JD, and a PhD, all focus in economics. I've had the opportunity to serve as TIAA-CREF's National Advisory Committee Chairman over the past year, so I've gotten to know Roger in a little bit of a different capacity. And I've had the opportunity to actually watch how he leads from a CEO perspective and what that organization is doing. It is nothing short of impressive in terms of the transformation that organization has gone through. But more importantly, and one of the reasons why I asked Roger to join us today is to really listen to his perspective on what has been, what is, and what will be happening in the economic and kind of financial world. So please join me in giving Roger a Duke welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for keeping it short. Kyle, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. As Kyle has indicated, well, I've got some prepared remarks. The real point is for me to listen to your questions. So I'll make sure I give my prepared remarks in a way that is clear, but then hopefully that will stimulate some questions. I'm always impressed to see people who I know always wear coats and ties and business attire around when you're on the campus, so I know you didn't dress up for me. Anyway, this will be interactive. I also want to say I'm really impressed that the students have organized this. I gather that here in the Duke campus, in particular at this school, it's really very student-led, and this gives you a great chance to exercise lots of leadership, intellectual leadership, organizational leadership, and other things. So I think that's a real positive comment and positive remark for you that you managed to pull all this together. I'm really impressed by that. I've been asked to talk about a number of topics, which I will touch on. The debt ceiling is, I think, on people's minds, the S&P downgrade of the U.S. economy, sovereign debt, differences between 2008 and now. So I'll touch on those topics, plus others, and then make sure there's plenty of time to think about and respond to your questions. So let me begin by looking at the topics that you've asked me to discuss, and I'm going to address them sort of in tandem as opposed to seriatim, one at a time, because they all really are quite close related. So all of you are quite familiar with what's been happening. Unless you had a summer internship in Antarctica, you will know that we've had a very, very volatile summer in terms of market dynamics and in terms of what's happening on the Hill. You know on the Hill that there was a last-minute deal that was struck to create some opportunities for the U.S. to avoid what one might have described as an economic Armageddon by going into a potential default on the U.S. debt for the first time in the 200-plus-year history of the Republic. And just when everyone breathed a bit of a sigh of relief, thinking that we had dodged that bullet, Standard & Poor's decided to downgrade the U.S. credit rating. And that, as you know, sent markets reeling, even as the three other agencies reaffirmed their AAA on the U.S. Since that time, markets have been highly volatile, as volatile as any period since the financial crisis of 2008-2009. In fact, there was a 4-day period in August when the S&P ultimately rose and then declined by 4% or more each day. And I think that's the first time that's happened in the 83-year history of that particular index. So good news for you, you've lived through historic times already. Markets clearly remain quite volatile. I think the drive for the more recent volatility has much more to do with global economic outlook, and in particular the sovereign debt crisis in Greece. There was a headline today that says Rome fiddles while Greece is burning. And I think that really describes the challenges that we are confronting in Europe. The challenge there, though, is not just around Greece, but also Portugal, Ireland, the so-called pigs, as you know, have all, I think, come under a little bit of stress and pressure with respect to the debt crisis there. The crisis in Europe has hit the banks particularly hard. The European banks have found it difficult to fund themselves in dollar-denominated currencies to support their dollar-denominated obligations. And there's a real fear that this will spread throughout the entire Eurozone and then possibly to the global financial system. And a reflection of that, just last week, Moody's decided to downgrade 2 of the major banks in France because of their exposure or perceived exposure to Greece. So obviously, there's a great deal of uncertainty impacting and affecting markets at this moment. And all of you know, the one thing markets hate is uncertainty. And there's quite a difference between risk-taking and managing through periods of uncertainty. So what are investors uncertain about or fearing? Recession in Europe, which could potentially further dampen already weak prospects for growth here in the US, and therefore lead us back into not just a double dip in the US, but truly a double dip across the globe. Having said that, I think there's really quite a marked difference between the volatility that we're confronting in 2011 versus what we confronted in 2008 and 2009. For one thing, there were clearly some specific macroeconomic issues affecting us in 2008. We clearly were entering into a recessionary time at that moment. What we saw was that many households were clearly overextended in terms of debt that they had taken on, and the economy clearly was taking a bit of a nosedive back then. We saw at that point something we actually still have not yet seen again, which is a huge foreclosure wave. What's happening now, I think, is in some sense less about a specific macroeconomic issue, but more about a lack of confidence because of macroeconomic uncertainties. Investors have, I think, a lack of confidence, not just about the economic outlook, but more importantly about the interaction between economics and politics. Or to put it another way, I think there's a real lack of confidence in political leadership in the political system. I think the showdown that emerged over the raising of the debt ceiling left many investors uncertain about the ability of our political parties to reach a consensus, to come to an agreement about solving the core problems that we are clearly confronting. And frankly, I think there's a similar lack of confidence about Europe and the ability of the Europeans to get their act together. And indeed, that was echoed as recently as this morning when the IMF released its World Economic Outlook. And in the press release around that, quite literally the phrase that the Europeans need to get their act together was expressed by some of the leading policymakers at the IMF. So clearly, while there was a lack of confidence in 2008, I think that was more driven by macroeconomics. And this time, I think the lack of confidence is driven by an uncertainty about the ability, the willingness perhaps, but certainly the ability of our political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic to, quote, get their acts together. A second big difference was that in 2008, there was a real question about the future of the financial system globally. We weren't sure about the financial strength or status of many of our leading institutions, in fact, almost all of them, with the obvious exception of TIAA-CREF, whose strength has never been questioned. People even wondered, frankly, if we were confronting would be confronting the kinds of run on the bank that we had seen back during the Great Depression. I think with the exception of some of the downgrades we've seen in Europe, very few people are questioning the fundamental soundness of the banking system globally. Individual banks, perhaps, but not the banking system. And people are clearly recognizing that individual banks may have to recapitalize themselves, but the banking system is much more solid. And I think that's quite different from where we were in 2008. This lack of confidence that I've talked about in the political system obviously has macroeconomic ramifications, right? It is clearly causing weaker consumer confidence, investor confidence, and business confidence. And so it has, I think, part of the explanation for the reduced momentum that we've seen in the second half of the economy, in the second half of the year in the economy, is driven in large part by all of this uncertainty about the politics of the US and in Europe. And if you need any evidence that individuals no longer trust their government, there was a recent poll released by Gallup, and it showed that the federal government came in dead last when Americans were asked to rank 25 business and industry sectors. The federal government had been close to the bottom, but this is the first time that it fell even lower. It had to knock off the oil and gas industry, for example, to get to last place. Interestingly, it won't surprise you, but it surprised me. The top 5 in terms of trust and confidence, in terms of industries, are computers and food, which clearly tells us something about what America's thinking about these days. Somewhere between Game Boy, if people still do that, and the chance to eat potato chips has come in top of the list here. So the challenges right now are investors have little confidence in governments, US or European. The US economy is clearly, in part because of that, I think, growing well below its potential. And the third thing that's going on here that's very important is that the housing market continues to be quite weak. I suspect all of you are probably readers of the Wall Street Journal, so if you saw today's front page story in the Wall Street Journal? How many people had a chance to take a look at that? You will by the time this is over, one hopes, okay? Take a look at it. It's a very good article and explains a number of important things that have occurred. One is that approximately 20% of households now find that their mortgage is underwater, if you will. The value of their house is less than the value of their mortgage. We've lost $7 trillion of housing wealth since the beginning of the recession. And equity versus house as a percentage of house prices has gone from around 60% to closer to 40%. So you can imagine that there are phenomenal difficulties. The other thing that's happened in the housing space is that we see that this crisis with respect to housing has hit some states particularly hard, the states that I would describe as the sand states, so Nevada, Florida, California, et cetera, and is making it difficult for individuals to move from those states into the parts of the economy that have job openings. So we're finding that the housing market is critically important as a third feature of what is driving some of the volatility. So you're probably asking, that's really nice. What a great guy. We invite the guy, come, we get all dressed up, and he tells us how bad things are. And I'm just here to tell you the truth. So let me then talk a little bit about what we see going forward, and then take it down to a slightly lower level, if you will, that maybe is more directly relevant to you. So the good news and the bad news is that I think we at my company expect that markets will remain volatile. In spite of that, we expect to see modest increases in economic growth later this year, but it will take, I think, some time before we get back to really robust growth. So the economic recovery will, I think, remain painfully slow. Let me talk a little bit about now my company and what we're seeing here. As Kyle indicated, we are the not-for-profit company. We are TIAA-CREF. We manage about $470 billion of other people's money. We have about 3.7 million participants. And one of the things that has been quite noticeable in our participant base is that there's clearly an inverse relationship between the S&P index and the volume of phone calls that we receive, and also obviously the nature of those phone calls. So on any given day, there's a clear relationship. If there is a 6% decline more or less in the S&P, we find a 10% boost in our call volumes. What we're finding when we listen to our clients is that they clearly are quite nervous about their savings. And some wonder if they should even pull everything out of the market. So the advice that we're giving, and the advice that I would give all of you, particularly because of your relatively young ages, is something that's been confirmed time and time again. The most important response in these times of great market uncertainty and volatility, we advise our clients, and I advise you, is to keep a long-term perspective. If their investment strategy has been in place for some time and their portfolio accurately reflects their risk tolerance, which is an important thing, a portfolio reflecting your risk tolerance, and is appropriately diversified, then I think you should take a long-term view and stay the course. Another thing that we clearly emphasize, and I think you understand because you're in finance, is the futility of doing market timing. Far too many people in this country think that they're going to try to buy low and sell high, but they panic when they see this kind of volatility, and they end up selling often at the top of the market and regretting that they did that. And I assume that none of you would manage your portfolios that way, correct? But you'd be surprised at the number of folks who I think have a general incentive to do that. So it's always very, very important to keep the long-term view in mind. It's also important as I address this group of people who are going to be business leaders to remind you as business leaders that you also are going to have to keep the long-term perspective in mind. As I think about some of the things that have happened, it is quite clear that in many businesses, short-termism is a source of some of the problems that we've confronted. You've got to, as business leaders, you really have to keep your eye on the big picture, have really a keen understanding of history and also how the future might unfold. So these are some of the issues that I think are important to you. Let me give you a little bit of comfort about the future that you might be confronting, right? Because you look around, you've heard me say market volatility will continue. A relatively slow growth is likely for the next several years. Unemployment is likely to remain high. There are some good elements of moderately good news from your standpoint, or relatively good news. One is, it shouldn't surprise you, but folks who are going to have the kind of economic academic background that you have are dealing with a very different market from many other people in America. The unemployment rate for people with a master's degree is less than half of the overall rate, around 4%. Unemployment rate for people who have less than a high school diploma is more likely to be 14% or so. So as economists would say, there's a real value in building the kind of human capital that you are doing. The other point I'd make about your futures now is also it's important to keep a global outlook. And I think it's even more important for folks who are going to be business leaders as you are to maintain that global outlook. So here you're learning about statistics and finance, obviously accounting, et cetera. All that is quite important. But I think the biggest opportunities for your generation will be folks who have a global perspective. And I just had the chance to have lunch with your dean and with Seth and Kyle, and I was briefed on some of the global opportunities that Fuqua is offering, and I'm really quite impressed with all of that. I've come to this perspective about the global opportunities, not just from things that I've read or in general press, but I've been quite impressed by a book written by a fellow named Michael Spence. I don't know how many of you know Mike Spence, know of Michael Spence. He is a PhD economist from Harvard. More importantly, he was the dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, went on to be dean another great business school out in Stanford, won the Nobel Prize in economics, and has recently written a book called The Next Convergence, The Future of Economic Growth in a Multi-Speed World. And Michael, in that book, has some really very important insights. And he describes dramatically how the world after World War II was one of divergence, and now we have one of convergence. And what does that mean? What's happening, as Mike Spence points out so well in this book, is that the gulf between people in the advanced economies and the emerging economies is steadily shrinking. Hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in the recent decades. And that, I think, is going to be one of the important themes as you enter and mature as business leaders. Some of the statistics that have come out recently, this is from a Time magazine article. In Brazil, per capita GDP more than doubled between 2000 and 2008. In China, the number of internet users rose from 22 million to 420 million between 20 and 2010. Though I wouldn't put a huge amount of weight on this statistic. In Russia, the number of Bentleys sold rose by 100% from 0 to 103, if you want to follow the Bentley index, between 2000 and 2009. So those are just a few little anecdotal or statistics that sort of drive a little bit of this conclusion that we're confronting or benefiting from this great convergence. There are a couple of other things that we see and that I think you're really well aware of. The most rapidly growing parts of the world are obviously at this stage not in the US, but that's been true for many, many years. 13 countries, including China, have grown by more than 7% a year for 25 years or more. The Asian miracle in Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan has been phenomenally transformative in those countries. In that region, for example, in 1981, it had one of the world's highest poverty rates. 80% of people in Southeast Asia lived on incomes of less than $1.25 a day. By 2005, just 18% lived in such dire poverty. And Mike Spence predicts by 2050, 75% or more of the world's population will live in what we think of as advanced countries. So this is truly transformative. It's truly a sea change. And obviously, your ability to manage your way and lead your way through a global economy will be very, very important. So let me try to talk about one or two other themes and open it up for questions. So I've talked about economic convergence. You can imagine as an individual who thinks about retirement, there are other big themes as well that have come to light. So one of these is a demographic convergence, and it's going to be up to your generation to manage or help manage through this huge demographic sweep that we're dealing with. All of you are well aware, or you might be aware, that this is the year when my generation, the baby boomers, start to turn 65. We're going to have, over the next 20 years, 80 million people, more or less, turning 65 and moving into what we think of as retirement age. In fact, one statistic is that there's a baby boomer who turns 65 every 8 seconds. It is obviously not the same baby boomer, but there are baby boomers who are doing that. But this is not just simply a US issue. It's really a global issue. And so we see countries like China, South Korea, and Mexico, which are also confronting exactly the same challenge of an aging population. So global aging, I think, presents a number of challenges that all of us are going to have to manage together. One of them is quite obvious now, already in the US and in Europe, and will become obvious to other places, which is the global challenge around fiscal burdens of pensions and health care. So if we think what's driving many of the concerns here, and certainly in Greece and in other parts of Europe, it is really the interaction of this global aging process and the fiscal challenges. There may be some other challenges as well, which you will all have to confront: potential labor shortages, immigration pressures, threats to financial stability, and in some cases, social and cultural conflicts. So I raise these because I think as future leaders, you're going to confront not just the convergence that I've talked about, but also this big demographic shift that is going to be quite important. The final thing that I want to raise, and then we'll open up for questions and comments, is your role as future business leaders and some of the lessons that we've learned in the recent past. I've already talked a little bit about the short-termism that might have affected lots of individuals. I think the other thing that's going to be one of your challenges as business leaders is that we're confronting an age in which business, while not in the same disrepute as the government that I've just talked about, is under a certain amount of disrepute. No longer is it the case that people believe what's good for business is good for America or good for the world. And I think it's going to be up to your generation to prove the ability to think both about your shareholders and to think more broadly about your stakeholders. To think about both the internal dynamics of the companies, the businesses that you'll be founding or leading, and also to think about what the economists would describe as externalities. And so I think your challenge is going to be an important one, dealing with these big global swings I've talked about, trying to understand how to manage your organizations, the ones that you found, the ones that you lead, but manage them in a way that leads to a better social outcome. Because I think that's really a big demand for business at this stage. So let me stop and just remind you of the points that I've made. First, I started talking about the issues that are foremost on your mind in terms of macroeconomics. I did not have positive news. I think I had accurate news that I think the things are quite different from 2008, 2009 in terms of the degree of uncertainty. But I think the future over the next few years is going to be one of relatively slow growth, continued market volatility, relatively high unemployment. Having said all of that, for folks such as those in this room, I think there will be opportunities. The unemployment rate is much lower for people who have a master's degree than for those who don't. And there are opportunities to create businesses, to be entrepreneurial, to drive things forward. Second point I made is as you go out and become business leaders, you're going to confront some big demographic challenges. You're going to confront the convergence of what we used to think of as the emerging world and the advanced world. I believe that creates some challenges. I believe that creates great opportunities for you. And then the final point that I've made is as you go forward and become real business leaders and take advantage of those opportunities, I think it's going to be quite important for you to both lead with a focus on the internal dynamics of your companies, the organizations, et cetera, that you lead or found, but also to think about the externalities, to take a long-term view as well as a short-term view, to think about society's needs as well as the needs of yourself and your own companies. So those are my three major lessons or points at this stage. I'd like to stop at this point and thank you for your attention and then open up for any questions and answers that I can possibly give. So thank you very, very much. So now is your chance. I'll step out from behind the podium. I'll get some water. And if you want to pepper me with questions, Kyle encouraged you to ask all your hard ones. When I was at the Fed, I used to say, this is a great chance. You may ask questions, and I can decide whether or not I want to answer them. And you may or may not know which I choose to do. But I feel obliged now, being a leader in the private sector, to give the most direct and responsive answers I can. So, yes, sir. And here comes the microphone. And would you do me a favor of introducing yourself and tell me just a bit about your background?
Yeah. Joel McIntyre from California originally, and then been working in private equity in Richmond, Virginia. So.
Oh, good. Okay.
Question as it revolves around the current U.S. stance on our dollar policy and the depreciation of the dollar relative to other currencies. Mm-hmm. And what is your take on our current stance and suggestions you would have if we were to convert more to a strong dollar policy and options there?
Right. Thanks for the question. I actually think that, in all honesty, the U.S. has a dollar policy that is the result and consequence of other policies, as opposed to a clear intended policy, if you will. So there's no question, and the Fed fully understands this, when you are creating the kind of liquidity that the Fed is creating, when they are keeping interest rates relatively low, and there's going to be an announcement today at 2:30 or so in terms of what their next activity is going to be. It's certainly not going to be to raise interest rates. You're going to have a case where your currency starts to depreciate. On the other hand, the other thing that's happened, obviously, is contrary to what many people believed, and even after the S&P downgrade, the U.S. currency benefited versus some others because we are still relatively strong, or a relative safe haven compared to some other economies. And so the reality of our policy, I think, in the U.S. is we really are letting our currency reflect the fundamentals. When there's optimism about the U.S. versus other places, not in an absolute sense, we see the dollar rising. On the other hand, as the Fed keeps interest rates low, you're getting a much weaker dollar. That is what always happens. And the reason that happens, or one of the benefits from doing that, though it hasn't really emerged yet, is that allows us, obviously, to have a more export-driven economy. Now, normally that works pretty well if the rest of the world is growing quickly. Right now, the rest of the world isn't growing quickly. So having a relatively low dollar, the result of the Fed policy, is not creating the kind of channel for growth that it often has in the past. Should we move to a strong dollar policy? I think the reality is, though I understand why he did it, Bob Rubin introduced this notion that a strong dollar is good for the U.S. A strong dollar is good for the U.S. in the sense that it keeps inflation relatively low, which is a very positive thing. A dollar that floats without much intervention from anybody else, including our own Treasury, I think is the thing that really is the best, because it allows the dollar to be a little bit of a shock absorber when we have a weak economy versus an overly strong economy. So I would argue, instead of attempting to have a real dollar policy, what we should do is be true to the actual dollar policy, which is we let the dollar float and reflect the fundamentals. The only challenge about that, and then I'll go to the next question, is that approach works as long as everybody else, all the other players, keep the same approach. And as you well know, there's a certain amount of debate and discussion about what the Chinese do with their currency, because they are allowing it to move up and down a little bit, but one might argue that they aren't allowing it really to reflect fundamentals, because it probably would appreciate a bit more than it has thus far. So the other part of the U.S. dollar policy is to really work with the Chinese and push them, I think, relatively quietly and hopefully with more effect, to allow their currency to move and to float a bit more, because that would help to deal with these global imbalances that we're dealing with, and actually could have a very positive effect both in their economy and in our economy. So I think we ought to let the dollar itself float and reflect fundamentals, and we should work really hard to work with other countries such as China to get them into that mindset as well. Hope that's responsive. Hope there are other questions. Here's a hand up here.
My name is Luis Edwards. I have worked in the asset management industry in South America, in Peru and in Chile.
In Chile. Okay.
It seems to me that the market right now is expecting a lot from the Fed. And considering, tied into what you said about the lack of confidence, what other options has the Fed, to stimulate the economy? Because the long-term rates are already low. So
right.
What are options they have?
Right. There are 2 or 3 other options that people talk about, all of them with the effect of keeping long-term rates low for even a longer time. They've already exercised one of those options, which is to announce that they have an intention of keeping rates low for a specified period of time, a conditional commitment to keep rates low. They could continue to talk about what they intend to do by either having a formal higher inflation target. Right now, informally, the Fed is thought to want to keep inflation around 2% or so. So one of the Fed presidents has suggested that they should announce a higher inflation target, call it 3 or 4%, and or something that they've never had before, a formal unemployment rate target. And the theory of the case is if the society knows that the Fed wants inflation to be a little higher, or the Fed is going to keep interest rates low until unemployment comes down, that would speed up that process of getting to that outcome, because the Fed at the end of the day, is incredibly powerful in terms of doing these things. The second thing that they might do, and it's much talked about, particularly today because they're going to make their announcement at 2:30, is adjust their balance sheet. The Fed has a very large balance sheet, over $2 trillion. It's all U.S. government securities. Most of it is U.S. government securities. And one theory is they could sell their short-term securities and go out and buy longer-term securities. This goes by the nickname Operation Twist. It was something that was done in the 60s. The theory of the case is that you would then really flatten the yield curve and drive long-term interest rates even lower than they currently are. That's the second option. The third option, relatively small, the Fed has the right to pay interest rates on the reserves that banks keep there. Right now, that interest rate is relatively low. If they drop that interest rate to 0, the theory of the case was that would be an incentive to drive banks to go out and lend more money. And then the fourth option is to renew open market purchases of government securities. This would be called QE3, not to be mistaken for the famous QE2 or QE1, but it would look exactly the same. And that's the fourth option. As you think about those, option 4, I think, has very little support in the Fed right now, and has very little support outside of the Fed, though they should not be driven by political matters. It was quite clear the number of people think that would not be a good idea internally or externally. Therefore, I think the other 3 options are probably much more likely on the table. And we'll see which ones they do. The market has a big expectation that they'll announce something like Operation Twist today. I have no reason to know what they're going to do. But I think they are going to have to figure out using those 3 tools and maybe some new things to try to keep interest rates relatively low for some period of time. And I think that's what they're going to attempt to do. Is that responsive? Is that clear? No? Yes? Yeah, sure. But bring the microphone. He wants to ask your question. I'll repeat or your comment back.
To me, the problem is about confidence in the population. So, I mean, they can keep rates low, but still, banks are not lending money.
Right.
How can we change that?
Well, that's a different issue, right? The Fed can only do one thing. They can control interest rates and create liquidity. Confidence, I think, is going to return when some of the other issues that I've talked about return, in my assessment. So a couple of things have to happen. One is I think there really has to be some greater clarity both in the US and Europe as to how political leaders are going to deal with these problems. Because if I'm right, that part of the uncertainty has to do with our apparent inability to get a consensus in Washington around dealing with unemployment, creating jobs, et cetera. That's part of the confidence. The Fed, I don't think, can drive confidence. They can drive interest rates. They cannot drive confidence. Certainly the same thing is true in Europe. There's a huge amount of headline risk. Every time Angela Merkel meets with Sarkozy from France and they come out with a statement, the world wants to know, are they going to support Greece or not support Greece, or what's going to happen with Greece? Those are political decisions. And on my assessment, at least, I could be wrong, much of the confidence issue has to do with uncertainty about the political time frame. There's also obviously a lack of confidence because individuals see their single largest asset, which is the house for most people, dropping in value or not rising in value, and they're indebted on it, et cetera. I think that's going to be a trickier one to deal with. There have been a number of studies. I did one relatively small paper. There's been a big book written by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart on this topic. It takes a long time when you have the bursting of a housing bubble to bring confidence back in that market. So this issue around confidence is not something the Fed can directly control. They can do what they can do with monetary policy. But the confidence issues, I think, come from either solving the apparent political gridlock and or, frankly, just the passage of time as housing starts to turn around and come back. So I think looking to the Fed to deal with confidence is you're not looking in the right place. Okay? Is that a little better? You got it? You may not like it, but did you understand it? Okay. Is there a question back there? Yes, sir. I think.
So our journal today was an article about Barney Frank's proposal to tighten the number of people in the FOMC. Somebody that was a member, what do you think about that? So to me, it would seem to make sense broadening instead of tightening. But,
okay. Well, let me first, as a matter of full disclosure, I've known Barney Frank since we were the age of most people in this room. He was one of my classmates in law school, and I have a high regard for him. He's a very sharp person. Having said all of that, I don't agree with this particular thought that he's proposed. I think it's really quite helpful to have some folks on the FOMC who have not, haven't been driven through the political process, we'll put it that way. I think it is really helpful to have the regional presidents rotating and voting because the Fed is set up to be, in some sense, very Washington-centric and in some sense very reflective of the broad demographics of society overall. And if everybody on the Fed had gone through the same kind of senatorial confirmation process, or if everyone on the FOMC had done that, I think you would really narrow the range of views, you'd narrow the range of discussion. I think that would not be a good thing. And I say that even though I will tell you sometimes some of the Fed presidents are taking very divergent points of view. You see it right now. I think that creates some uncertainty in markets, for sure, but it really is a reflection of divergence of views around the economy. So I actually think the current system, though it is filled with imperfections, would not be made better by having either a smaller FOMC or having everyone in the FOMC coming through exactly the same process, because I think you get, if you will, a tendency to narrow and converge around a consensus view, which may make things a little easier, but almost all of the work that I've seen suggests that divergent views and diversity of thought ends up leading to a better outcome. So, you know, it may sound sort of status quo and defending the establishment, and of course, you know, he's a former vice chairman, what do you expect him to say? But I've thought about this quite a bit, and I actually do think having different processes to get to the FOMC, having to reflect broad national interests, and frankly, though sometimes it's not comfortable, having a divergence of views ultimately ends up, I think, at a better place. And as I think about the mistakes the Fed has made over the course of its history, it often comes from not having a broad enough divergence of views. Okay? Hope there are other questions. Are you pointing or are you raising your hand? Ah, okay. Sir, yeah.
Sorry, my name is Chad Harris. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. Just had a question for you in terms of just unemployment. So obviously we've heard a lot about unemployment. How much of this do you think is, you know, more recent trends versus a long-term build-up? Meaning, is our current workforce just not equipped to meet the current economy that we have? And how does the education system play in that?
Right. There's no question in my mind that this unemployment rate that we're dealing with is a cyclical event. It's a macroeconomic event due to weakness in the economy. If you think about it, and the unemployment rate in the US tends to average around 4%. It goes up and down, obviously. But it's remarkably stable, actually, through the ups and downs of the economy. Yes, during the recession, it goes up, and then it comes down, et cetera. And the reason I say that is, in fact, even as the economy has transitioned from heavy manufacturing and iron and steel and automobiles in Detroit out to Silicon Valley and Steve Jobs in Seattle, we have managed to create enough jobs to keep the unemployment rate on average around 4%. So I therefore do not think that what we're confronting right now is a reflection of a gigantic mismatch that's going to keep us at a high unemployment rate for a long time. I think much of it is really reflective of the cycle. Point two, having said that, there are some things that are unique about this cycle in terms of the inability of individuals to move out of their homes and go to places where the jobs exist that make this really quite different in some ways. So there's that kind of mismatch where I'm sure there are folks who are highly qualified for roles who are living in houses, let's say in Nevada or California, parts of California or Florida, who could get jobs if they could move, but they couldn't get out of their homes. So there's that component to it that makes this a little different. The role of education, I'm glad you raised it. I think education is, and this is not just a pablum kind of statement, I think education is fundamentally critical to society going forward. The reason is that almost every job that I see, almost every job class that I'm aware of, has a much higher intellectual content now than it may have 10, 15, 20, certainly 30 or 40 years ago. If you go to a manufacturing plant, I was on the floor of an automobile manufacturer a little while ago. What you're seeing is not big burly people, guys with wrenches, you know, tightening things or loosening things. What you're seeing is individuals programming computers, working with computerized equipment, working with robots, et cetera. There's a lot more mental construct and mental input into even manufacturing jobs than there was several years ago. I think consequently, education at all levels is going to be critically important for all of you folks. I think it's also going to be quite important because of the global nature of the job market. All right, so right now, the job market for many roles, particularly in the service sector as well as in manufacturing, is quite global. The best jobs will go to those who have the best productivity. The best productivity comes from higher education and merging human capital, which is what education is, with physical capital. So there's no question in my mind that education is going to be important. The third point I'd make is, this may surprise you. While what you're doing is incredibly important and getting a post-undergraduate education is highly valuable, it turns out, and I may be off here a little bit because I'm not an education economist, but as I've read this work, it turns out the biggest return on investment for education actually is preschool education. So not to take away from all the things you're doing, because there's a huge return on having gone to Duke at any point in your life. But it turns out that much of one's experience in life is heavily driven by the degree of preschool education that one has. And so I now firmly believe in education. As you can imagine, I stayed in school until I was 30, so I believe in education at all levels. But in terms of what the statistics seem to be showing us, if we can get more and more kids into a very good preschool outcome, that will help to pay dividends throughout their lives for lots of different reasons. So, big believer in education, believe that we are confronting some unusual situations right now that make the unemployment rate relatively high, but I do not think that we're in a place where we'll just be unable to create good jobs going forward, because if I look back at the great swath of American history, we've always been able to retool our education force to deal with the job, or our labor force to deal with the jobs over there, and therefore we have this sort of relatively flat average unemployment rate of around 4%. Okay? Make sense? Got it? Okay. Hope there are other questions. There's one up here. There's something back there. Don't worry. Your professor's saying students first.
Hi, my name is Vanessa. I'm from Colombia. Thank you so much, first of all, for your presentation. I have a follow-up question on the unemployment answer you were giving us, and another question. So the first question is that, as far as I understand, the unemployment in the US is now becoming a structural unemployment, which means that also the people who have been unemployed for more than, I don't know exactly the measure, but I think it's 8 weeks or so, now are becoming not only unemployed in the sense that they are not going to find a job, but they are also not going to look for a job.
Right.
And tying that to the problem about the economy, I think that this will turn into these employers, these unemployees will become non-competitive.
Right.
And if you see people from other countries like China or Brazil, where there's a huge demand for skilled work, how do you think this could affect these? Or what measures could the U.S. Take into consideration to try to employ these people that are becoming no longer employed or competitive? And my other question was regarding the financial system. Where do you see banking, the main banks and the main financial institutions over the next 3 years, given that the housing market continues to be weak, the new regulations that are going to take place in the next years, and also that, as was mentioned before, the companies are not currently investing?
Right. Okay. Two very good questions, as have been all the questions. Let me answer them in reverse order. I think the banks are actually going to continue to be in reasonably good health because interest rates are relatively low. And you have to understand that one of the indirect impacts of having interest rates low but still having even a moderately upward sloping yield curve, right? Lower interest, short-term interest rates somewhat lower than long-term interest rates, which I think will continue to happen, is that the banks are in a position where they can make money when they do lend. They also make money, obviously, in trading and other things. So we have gone through a period where the banks have been able to write down their bad loans. They've actually had, for some cases, a better loan experience than they had feared, which helps to create P&L profits for them, and relatively low interest rates. So the structural setup that the Fed is creating with low interest rates, even as they do the kinds of things we're talking about, have the impact of supporting the banking system overall. That will allow the banks to do something that you've talked about implicitly, which is to recapitalize themselves and build a larger capital base. So it will depress what would otherwise be larger profits and make them, I think, smaller profits. The other thing that you should know, or that I think is the case, the challenge that the banks are having right now, or a question, is their willingness to lend. And that, I think, is a problem of both supply and demand. I think banks are not certain who might be creditworthy, but I also think because the economy is generally weak and we're not getting as much job creation and not creating as many businesses, frankly, as we should, there's also a little bit of a lack of demand. So when you talk to bankers about this, they're saying it's not an issue of supply of credit, it's demand for credit. I think the truth is somewhere in between. I think banks have been cautious about lending, but we also see that companies have $2 trillion on their balance sheets. So companies aren't aggressively borrowing either. So the headline around banks is, I think even as the economy is going to continue to be relatively weak, not robust in terms of growth, I think the setting of policy will be such that it will support banks themselves being relatively healthy and allowing them to recapitalize themselves. In fact, that's one of the goals of policy. On your first question about unemployment, you're absolutely right to say that all the economic analysis clearly indicates that as people remain unemployed for long periods of time, for 1 year, 2 years, et cetera, they become what is called unattached from the labor force. We see a large number of discouraged workers. We see a large number of workers working part-time who want to work full-time. And then we see individuals who just simply give up the search altogether and fall out of the formal labor market. This is a significant problem. We have unemployment this high. That's quite different, I think, from the question of will we ever see unemployment come down to the norms. So there's a transition point that you're absolutely right to make. The way to deal with this, and it's not easy, and we've never done it really well in the US, is to try to do as much retraining as you possibly can. That does not work as well as one would like. I think we also therefore have to keep some form of a social safety net, unemployment support for longer than has normally been the case. So you're absolutely right to point out there is this conundrum, for lack of a better word, of a large number of people who are disengaged from the labor force, losing skills, and we have to figure out how to retrain them to get back into the labor force, which has not been one of the great strengths of the US economy. So we are facing a little bit of a dilemma, right? Because we don't want to become, I think broadly, what the European societies have become, where we support large numbers of unemployed people for long periods of time, but we don't yet know really how to retrain them. And you're right to put it into a global context, but I think that's sort of a broader contextual issue and not sort of an immediate one. Okay, I can see from your body language at least it seems to be responsive. Okay. I hope there are other questions. I'm not even sure what time it is, but I'm happy to. Yes, sir, in the back. The microphone fellow is coming.
Do you think...
Is it on? Maybe the other one. There you go.
Do you think or believe that Greek will default, and how should I manage my retirement portfolio for this year?
If you want to manage your retirement portfolio, I want to give you one of my business cards.
Can I add one other thing? I was watching CNBC a couple of days ago, and there was someone saying that the banks are not really stating how exposed they are to a Greek default. So what would you think? I'm not privy to any other balance sheet. Our balance sheet is quite clean in terms of European bank exposures. I don't think that the US banks have an overexposure to Greek debt. That's a judgment not based on lots of facts, just based on some general knowledge of the way banks run themselves. And the fact that one could see this crisis coming, right? You don't have to be the most far-sighted asset liability person or risk person to think, well, European bank debt is probably not a smart place to be. So I trust that in general, US banks at least have managed to avoid that. European banks, I'm not so sure. And that's one of the reasons why Moody's, I think, downgraded a couple of the major French banks, but they did make some broad differentiations. Do I think Greece is going to default? I think the reality is not so much is Greece going to default, but how Europe is going to get through this challenge. So the degree to which Germany and France are going to support, particularly Germany, will support Greece through this process, I think is really the fundamental question, right? There's no doubt that Greece, because of its fiscal situation, is not going to be a very stable, credit-worthy country for some period of time. So the question is really, are the Germans ready to support them in doing this? And that's why there's so much headline risk around what the Eurozone is going to do or what Angela Merkel says, because it's just quite clear that the big challenge for Greece right now is to continue to get the European governments and the European Central Bank to support their debt and other debt. And that's, I think, where the real fundamental political challenge is. The other challenge is one that's sort of core to the Eurozone, which is historically the way a country would get out of this kind of problem that Greece is confronting is by devaluing its currency, creating some incentives, if you will, for exports, because their exports become cheaper when they devalue. So the ultimate challenge that Greece has is they no longer have a currency that they can devalue. So they're confronting a real challenge, which is, do they stay in the Eurozone and have the Germans support them in particular, or do they figure out a way to exit from the euro, either permanently or temporarily, reintroduce the drachma, lower the value of the Greek currency, whatever it would be called, and then re-enter the Eurozone at a different place, at a different peg. And that's, I think, it's not so much are they going to default, but really are they going to get support from Germany and the rest of Europe, or are they going to figure out a way, contrary to what the Maastricht Treaty expects, to exit the euro, devalue their currency, and come back in? So I think they want to avoid defaulting, but they only have two options, and neither one of them is quite clear right now. Is that sort of generally responsive? You have a follow-up?
Yeah, what about my retirement portfolio?
I told you, bring it to TIAA-CREF.
I guess should I invest half of it in bonds?
All right, well, you see now, this is, I meant what I said, right? You are 20 to 30 years younger than I am. Keep a long-term view. You're going to be working for at least 30 years, and then if you, quote, retire, you're going to have a very different kind of retirement, I suspect, which will be sort of an encore career, and you'll be in that mode for at least another 30 years. So if you're like most people your generation. So the reality is, if you're thinking, because remember, I think, I don't know if I said this, but longevity is increasing across the globe. In fact, in the US, the fastest growing cohort is people 85 to 90 right now. And it is estimated that approximately 20% of the people now 65 are going to live to be at least 90. So I don't know anything about you, your background, your health, or anything of that sort. I will predict that you're going to live to be at least 75, 80, and possibly 90, and maybe 100. Never even met you. Just because of the fact that you're well educated and you're relatively young. So if you've got another, call it 60 years of life expectancy, what you do with the retirement program? Very little. Invest for the long term, keep broad diversification, do not panic, and get good objective advice such as that TIAA-CREF gives. So, no, I say things in a funny way, but all four of those things are very important. You've got to keep a long-term perspective. You've got to figure out your risk tolerance, as I've said. You've got to avoid panicking and market timing. You must have good diversification, and I'm quite serious about getting good objective advice because this is a complicated thing. So those are the things, and since I don't know anything else about your portfolio, I think that advice is the best I can give you. Yes, ma'am. We have a question up front.
Hi, my name is Deanna Hill. I'm just wondering if I can get your thoughts on whether or not the financial markets can help in the municipal bankruptcy crisis that's going on with local governments, and a lot of state governments are going bankrupt. Where do you think the financial markets can come in there, or is that going to be completely a government policy thing? Like, is there any alleviation to that?
I think there are some things, and here this is, again, going to sound a little self-serving. I don't intend for it to be. Look, the crisis that we have in municipal finance is driven by exactly the same thing we have in national finance. Right? One is their revenue stream has fallen off, maybe in some cases collapsed, because of weaknesses in housing markets. Many governments finance themselves, obviously, off of real estate taxes. Sales taxes are way down because the economy is obviously relatively slow. And so their revenue streams are not as high as they used to be. At the same time, their obligations have not come off. Many of them have created very rich retirement plans, for example. They are confronting the need to continue to educate people, and we hope spend even more on education. And there are just a range of other social services that aren't cyclical. You know, you don't have, people don't demand less police service just because the economy is slow. You may end up having fewer policemen, but the demand for the service goes up. So municipal governments and state governments have a real problem, which is that their revenue is really quite cyclical, and their expenses, unless they aggressively manage them, aren't cyclical. And you add to it their long-term commitments, which are starting to come into play. So what can the financial markets do? Can't do very much about revenue, right, because it's driven by the cycle. But financial markets can help think through how they manage some of their expenditures in different ways. So you've seen governments privatize, for example, some local activities, highways, for example, prisons, which is something that states have done. You know, I'm not in this business, so I don't have a particular excitement about it one way or the other, but I think the ongoing privatization of infrastructure might end up being a way for governments to work through this. Not ideal, and there are pros and cons, but it's certainly something that we can do. A place where we actually have tried to help is we have been working with a number of governments to create a retirement plan that I think is more appropriate for what they need. So we have, in my company, created a hybrid plan for Orange County, California, for example. We're talking to a number of other states and municipalities about this plan. And the point there is it doesn't help solve the current problem with retirement benefit, but it does allow it to become, over time, much more sustainable. So I actually think there are some short-term things that financial markets can do in terms of infrastructure, and I think financial markets and financial engineering of the type that I've just talked about can help over the longer term as well to make the economic health of the states and municipalities a little more certain. I've got time for one or two more questions if there are any. I actually don't know what the schedule is in terms of when people need to get back to class. Do people still go to class?
Not on Wednesday.
Not on Wednesday. Oh, okay. What about Monday, Tuesday, Thursday? I know you don't go on Friday. No one does. Yes, sir.
Oh, hi. My name's Julian Singh. I'm actually from Melbourne in Australia, just here on exchange.
Good.
My question's around the volatility. Before you were describing one of the main drivers of the volatility is the political uncertainty in Europe and in the US. And in the US, there's a presidential election next year. I was just hoping you could share some thoughts around the prospects of things calming down in the US, or the markets being able to sort of react less extremely to the developments in the US. And then I guess my second question is just more broadly, do you, around the reactions to political like rumours around what's happening in Europe and the future of the EU, do you think that the market's perhaps overreacting at the moment, and how much longer, or how long will this go on for, this sort of extreme sensitivity to news coming out on the political front?
Right. I do think we're in for a period of ongoing market volatility, in part because both in the US and in Europe, we are confronting some very, very difficult challenges and very different mindsets about the way to go forward. So you may have noticed that a senior person on the ECB Governing Council, a person I actually know pretty well named Jürgen Stark, resigned because he had a very strongly different view. Well, he resigned for personal reasons was what was said, but many people think that he resigned because he had very strong personal views diametrically opposed to what the ECB was doing in terms of buying government debt, for example. So I think we're confronting both very, very difficult problems and the inability to find, a consensus that brings things forward either in the US or in Europe. And Jürgen's resignation may be an example of that. And here in the US, the way we've dealt with a variety of our challenges clearly are bringing out some fundamental differences. There are deep differences in thought about the role of taxation in creating global growth or domestic growth. There are deep differences in the questions of whether we've gone, as one of your questions might indicate, too far or not far enough in regulation, for example. There are fundamental questions to which there are no easy answers on what one might do in cleaning up after the bursting of a housing bubble. So I think because we're confronting very complex problems, no single consensus intellectual view about how to go forward, and an overlay, as you say, in the US of political elections, and in Europe, I think a weakness in their fundamental system being unmasked through all of this crisis, I think we're in for a period of ongoing volatility. And then you add to that what I expect to be a relatively weak growth structure here in the US, and that just sort of, I think, feeds into the volatility. So I fear, not fear, I expect that over the next some period of time, we're going to see ongoing market volatility, and I just don't think it's going to clear up anytime soon for the reason you talked about in terms of politics, but I think more broadly, the challenges are quite severe, and the ability to reach an intellectual construct that allows us to go forward is daunting. And then you add to that, as you point out, the fact that at least in the US, this has to do with a political election coming up. And in Europe, I'll say one more thing so you clear what I'm talking about. The fundamental challenge in Europe is that they have a single currency, a single monetary policy, but they don't have a single fiscal union. And so they're confronting this fundamental structural challenge that makes it hard for them to figure out how to go forward. I think I should be fair and just have one or two more questions, if there are any more. Right here. One of our professors.
Hi. You spoke a little bit about unemployment and a little bit about global imbalances. My question is about something that the Fed seems to debate a lot, and you mentioned that inflation target and an unemployment target might be part of today's policy response in 5 minutes. Which target for CPI do you think is more important, core inflation or headline inflation? And the reason why I ask that is because it's really central to the whole debate. Because it seems like the things that I own, they're going down in value. The things that I need, like food, they're going up, gas, they cost more. Right. And it's wrapped around the dollar question, which is the things we import seem to be more expensive because the dollar's weak. It seems like my wage is lower every year against inflation. So, you know, it's difficult for me to factor all those things together. Right. And it makes me question whether monetary policy is really just pushing on a string now, that rates are as low as it can go, and all the rest has to be done by politicians.
Two separate questions. Let me try to answer the first and then the second. Your question about whether or not the Fed should be looking at core or headline inflation has been a big debate in policy for a long time. I continue to believe that you should primarily be looking at, and mainly exclusively looking at two things. One is core, and second, inflation expectations. The reason that you have to be cautious about looking at headline inflation is, as you point out, it's really quite volatile. And so if the Fed tries to target some specific approach on, or target level for headline inflation, for top level inflation, given that monetary policy works with very, very long and variable lags, I think you'll never quite get there, right? There's some hope of stabilizing core inflation and letting the volatility of headline inflation sort of play out over time, because it does move back and forth. Second question that you've asked is, in the current conjuncture, is there really much room for the Fed to do anything? Are they really pushing on a string? You know, I think the answer is there are things that they can do, but as I said in response to one of the first questions, since this is in part a problem around confidence, keeping interest rates low doesn't by itself create confidence. But what it does do is, as I've said, helps to support the financial system, does help individuals at the margin, if they are continuing to be creditworthy, to get credit if that's what they want. So it creates a little bit of a safety net to keep an economy that's already weak from falling, further off the cliff, or falling off the cliff, if you will. So while it's not going to solve the confidence problem, it creates, I believe, conditions that allow the politicians, if they can find that intellectual consensus I was just talking about, to try to go forward. And that's one person's view. There are a bunch of people in the Fed who think that anything else that they do is going to be destabilizing. I heard from a now very senior in both ways statesman, a guy who's now 91, 92 years old, arguing from his deep experience that the Fed should be much more predictable. I understand that set of arguments, but I think the reality is at this stage, keeping interest rates low is probably better than raising them prematurely.
I got time for one more question.
One more, if there is one more. Oh, right here, this young lady.
Hi, I'm Julia Drake, and I spent 4 years on the lending side of the banking industry. And over the past year and a half, it wasn't so much that my bank wasn't lending money, it was just shifting from real estate to industries such as healthcare or professional services or energy. And the clients that I saw and potential borrowers that I saw hurt the most were the small businesses. Yeah. So, and getting an SBA, Small Business Association, loan approved is, it takes an act of Congress. It's incredibly hard to do. And so I'm wondering if there are any policies in place from your time on the Economic Recovery Advisory Board, if you heard of any policies outside of SBA to help spur lending and funding for these small businesses that provide so many jobs for our country. Right.
In some sense, the sad answer is no, which is not the answer you wanted to hear, right? The SBA, Karen Gordon Mills, who's now the head of the SBA, would want me to go through the long litany of programs they have in place, and they actually do have a number of programs in place that are meant to help through this crisis. They are focused in on agricultural as well as other kinds of programs, and they've done everything, they've done much that they can to speed up the process. So I think small businesses are still most likely to look to the government. It is very hard, as you know, to get banks to actually do much small business lending because, as you, I think, understand better than I, I'm sure you understand better than I, the credit quality of a small business is very unpredictable. The vast majority of them go out of business, as you well know. It's a little dangerous for for-profit entities to get too heavily involved in that lending. And it is also quite difficult, I think, for the U.S., for there to be a policy around this small business, and for the following reason. If the government were to encourage your bank or a bank to lend into small businesses, are they going to then, how are they going to deal with the possibility of losses, for example? And this is one of the big dilemmas in policy making, which is if you get too involved in the day-to-day decision making of the bank, are you going to be responsible or are you going to socialize the losses? So I think it's really quite complicated. And though small businesses create most of the jobs, they also are the most volatile sector. And it is therefore hard for for-profit entities to figure out how to support them and not create risk in their own balance sheet. So I think it's another one of those dilemmas where, for better or for worse, I think the government is most likely to be the best outcome. But as you point out, that tends to be a slow bureaucratic process. So I wish I could have given you a sort of more upbeat, exciting, sure, here are the 5 answers to small business. I've thought about it a little bit, not as deeply as you have. And I think it's just very vexatious to figure out how you, in a slow economy, create small business as the engine of growth. The one thing I didn't say is historically, the engines of growth when we come out of a recession is the one thing that's weakest now, which is the housing market. And so that's another part of the dilemma that we're confronting. It's the thing that has gotten us out of recessions in the past is interest rates go down. The most interest-sensitive sector is housing, and that's the one that's on its back. So another reason why we're having the particular challenge that we're having is that the tool that we have, interest rates, the tool that the Fed has, interest rates, is being stymied a little bit by both slow global growth, which means exports aren't going as quickly as we'd like, and also the fact that the housing market hasn't turned. Anyway, I've got to stop now. I want to do 3 things. I want to thank you all very much for your attention, for your questions, for sticking with us when I know you wanted to go to other classes, and I could imagine that. I want to reinforce the point I made about your role as future leaders. You're all being very, very well trained at one of the country's best business schools. Many of you come from other parts of the world, so one of the world's best business schools. I really do believe as business leaders, you've got an obligation to think about growing your business, growing your payroll, creating new products and services, but taking a longer-term perspective, avoiding the short-termism that has occurred in many other places, and trying to rebuild the notion of business leaders as being real societal leaders in a global society, which goes to my 3rd point, which is you are going to grow up in a society that is going to be much more globalized, deal with these global forces, and I wish you luck. So thank you all very much.
Dr. Ferguson, on behalf of the Duke University MBA Finance Club, we would like to offer you this token of appreciation.
Great. Thank you very much.
And we really thank you for all your effort and coming down here as our keynote speaker. And hopefully you can join us again sometime soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. This is a pleasure.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.